So today I'm joined by Michaela Boehm for a special Thomas Fire interview. The Thomas Fire is the largest wildfire in California state history. This fire has touched Michaela's life, and we're going to discuss what that's meant, how Michaela has used her training and life of practice to face the kind of life-changing adversity that we all hope to avoid, but realistically can happen to any of us at any time. Michaela has an extensive background both clinically and academically in psychology and counselling, having received her degrees in Jungian psychology and forensic psychology from the University of Vienna. She has over 25 years of clinical experience working one-on-one in private practice. She was the co-founder of a drug rehab in Malibu and worked in forensics. In addition to her professional background, she is the lineage holder of a woman's tantric lineage of Kashmir Shaivism, having begun her education at 16 years old with her teacher. Michaela teaches workshops internationally and still maintains a very impressive client roster of private clients, including movie stars, rock stars, and other very high-performing individuals. So, Michaela, thanks for the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
So, Michaela, can you tell us about the fires in California? What's the basic situation and how have they affected you?
Well, as you were saying, this is the biggest fire in California history, and it swept through my area and burnt my house down. So that's the situation. It's still burning actually. I think it's now 95% contained 3 weeks later, so it's still affecting the area. We're just coming back to a place where the air quality is bearable, and in my direct neighborhood about 130 houses burned down.
Mm-hmm. And perhaps you could talk a little bit about your house. It's of course your house, but it's also where you teach a lot of workshops. You have a farm with many rescue animals and so on. So what was the damage?
Well, it's not only my house, but it was essentially my absolute dream place. The place that I envisioned that I would live on and have my animals, and of course that's where we teach. You and I, and where people come. And so it's not just a house, it's a property, it has acreage, it has orchards, it had lots of animals, still has, but I lost most of my chickens, most of my ducks, all of my turtles and tortoises, and some of the dogs and cats. So it's been very tough and not easy to deal with.
Mm-hmm. And just to give some people an idea of the sort of devastation a fire like that could cause, it was a combination of very hot weather, the fire itself, and the Santa Ana winds, isn't that right?
Yeah.
Creating these firewalls of, how tall were they?
About 50 feet, they say. I mean, you can think of a fire, and it was a bit funny because my parents told some of their friends in Austria, and of course in Austria we don't have fires like that, and some woman said to my mother, well, that's stupid, why didn't you just call the fire department, they would have put it out.
It's a very Austrian
yeah, very Austrian thing to say, but of course it's not like that. Of course no one in Austria, or for that matter me, have ever seen what it looks like when 60-mile-an-hour winds whip up a firewall that just consumes everything in its path. And at some point, all the mountains around us were on fire, and you could see these huge walls of fire just eat up everything at such rapid pace. And that particular night when my house burned down, the winds were going so fast that they said that the fire moved an acre a minute. Mm. So just unbelievable devastation. And the thing, of course, that is hard to understand, and was hard to understand for me when I saw the house. It's not just a house. It's not just your house burns down. It kills everything in its path. All the trees, all the orchards, the barns, every bit of the property is just blackened and destroyed, and there's nothing left but bent metal and a foot of rubble, and that's it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the cars were totally melted. Your stove, which is for cooking, your iron stove was totally warped and collapsed in. So it must have been a tremendous heat, moving at a tremendous speed. And you actually weren't at the house at the time of the fire. We just finished up our year of teaching, in fact.
Right.
It was the morning after our final day when we were about to fly off. You to Austria to see your parents and me back home to England. And when we discovered about all this. So from there, you went more or less directly back. And so tell us a bit about that process. And we'll get on in a moment as to how your training and your background and your, because, it's interesting the way you've handled it with quite a lot of grace and determination. And you've been very productive in the face of all that loss, because you lost almost everything you owned.
Everything I owned except for what was in the suitcase.
And you travelled pretty light that trip.
Yes.
So
sadly, yes.
Yeah.
My favorite traveling jacket.
But I think people can learn something actually, and people have been asking, for you to talk about this. But people, I think, could learn something from the way you've gone about it. But anyway, so what was that process like? Are you leaving Europe and you have to fly back to California and so on?
Well, it was devastating, but it wasn't yet reality. Right? You hear about it, and I mean, you were with me when I heard that the house was burning, and it's hard to believe and it's hard to understand. And of course, I'm very visual, so in my whole memory and my whole way of processing is visual. So I hadn't seen the devastation yet. So in my mind, the house and everything I owned was still intact, so to speak. And then when I landed in LA after 30 hours of a pretty heavy duty stress and rebooking flights and making my way from Amsterdam to Munich, from Munich to Salzburg, slept there, drove back from Salzburg to Munich, flew from Munich to Gatwick, and then from Gatwick to LA, and then I hired a car service to take me to Ojai. And of course, the roads in and out of the area I lived in were blocked and closed, and nobody was allowed to go in. And so after a very, very long day of travel and a very long drive through thick, just horrible smoke, with fire right and left of the road, we made it to the roadblock, and I had to talk my way into the area where I live, which was completely off limits and mandatory evacuation. So I had to use every bit of skill, force, and determination to talk my way into the area, and I did. And I arrived at the house at around 8 in the evening or 9 in the evening, and it was pitch black and roaring crazy winds, and it was very, very scary, because the hills behind the house all the way up to the very top of the Topa Topas was on fire, and you can't, of course it's dark, so all you see is fire and you don't know how far it is away, and it was very low visibility, and everyone had evacuated the area except for my direct neighbors and Dion, my husband, and a few other people who didn't get out in time. And so the first 4 or 5 days we had no electricity. We had no food or anything for that matter. And the neighbors, the few neighbors who were there, all pitched together, and we went and emptied out freezers and fridges of people who weren't home. And people would pitch in their supplies so that we would eat, and we would eat together and have meals together. And that's essentially how it started. And I've been up here ever since. It's been 3 weeks, pretty much exactly 3 weeks. And it's just a daily odd occurrence to see everything that I've ever owned flattened to a foot of rubble.
Mm-hmm. And I just arrived last night, and already a couple of weeks after the incident, your teaching space survived, and the guest cottage survived.
Yeah.
Although everything else, all the other outbuildings and the main house itself were destroyed. So, I'm getting here and I'm seeing already you've ordered a complete stock of workshop supplies, and you're preparing the new teaching space, and we're basically good to go to start teaching, right away, basically. So, what was your game plan coming into that? Because you talk a lot about people, how they react to threatening situations. You're talking about fight, flight, freeze, and maybe outline a bit of that. But what are some of the common ways people deal? You've seen all these sorts of people here having lost everything. People are dealing in a variety of ways. What are some of the ways people are approaching it? Some more successfully than others. And what was your game plan when you finally got to the house?
Well, I think I got a little bit sidetracked there when we talked about how was it arriving. I mean, once I saw the house, it was incredibly shocking. It wasn't just the house, it was coming into an area that was a complete disaster area. And you see these things in movies, right? You see, the likes of, several male action movie stars walking through deserted towns with heavy smoke and total destruction, right? That's a Hollywood movie mainstay.
Yeah.
But when you actually end up in that scenario and you can't go outside without a mask because you can barely breathe and everything's covered in soot and ash, it's very shocking. It's very shocking on the system. Fire is also very shocking on the system, meaning you go into total fight or flight. And a lot of people did flight also because the evacuations were mandatory, so a lot of people just got out of there. And then some people, including my neighbors, and by default, because I came 2 days after the fire, we went into fight. And it was quite... It was interesting because there were a few situations where you could tell that people were about to start fighting, actually physically fighting.
Each other.
Yeah, because in moments where the tension would just rise very high and it was mostly men up here. There were a few women, but it was mostly men, and there was a very high fight response in most people. And thankfully, most people did channel it into being very productive. We spent a lot of time putting out hotspots. Dion and our friend John, who is a vet and is also my vet, for all the large animals, drove around and gave people reports if their houses had burned down or not, and helped with animals and all those kind of things. So most people channeled that intense fight reaction into doing something, and attacking things in a productive way. But there were certainly moments where people almost came to blow, and there were some odd situations a bit later when people were allowed back up here. But I've also seen people just completely freeze, and you see it now still, that there's a lot of shock and trauma and inability to move forward or do much because of the strong freeze that comes with something like that. And for myself, I can definitely say that when I landed and ended up in what really looked like a war zone, my body certainly went into fight. I didn't allow for freeze to happen because I have enough practice. And as you well know, because I teach about this all the time when we teach nonlinear movement teacher trainings, keeping the body moving prevents freeze if you know what you're doing. And I did that the whole way on the plane. I essentially spent 8 hours on the plane doing subtle nonlinear movement. And I also read on the plane about grief. There's an amazingly good book by Martin Prechtel that's called On Grief and Praise. It has some other title as well, but which I don't recall right now. And that really helped because I could keep myself from freezing, but I certainly went into quite intense fight mode, meaning, get going, get moving, don't stop, and deal with it and attack it head on.
People have that shock, whether it's a serious diagnosis, when you're sitting across from your doctor and they say, okay, they dropped the bombshell and life's not the same afterwards, or in this case you're in a natural disaster of some kind, you lose things, or there's a death. Maybe you could talk a little bit about fight, flight, freeze. What are they, and why is this nonlinear movement, or why does movement have some sort of positive effect on unfreezing the freeze and so on?
Yeah, I mean, to go very quickly into this, fight or flight is pretty well known in the way that we have a nervous system that is geared towards survival. So when in an actual or perceived danger situation, the body kicks in and essentially shuts down the thinking and planning mind and takes over. And the classic signs of fight or flight is the heightened pulse, the rapid heartbeat, the sweating, the tunnel vision, the output of the adrenaline. And then with that, of course, comes the ability to either fight something full on or run as fast as one can. And that's a pretty useful mechanism for human beings as a matter of survival for millions of years. And that particular mechanism can apply in an actual situation like this one, where it is, of course, very appropriate, can also apply in a situation that's more mind-based, because the mind doesn't know the difference between a real threat and an imagined threat. So your negative thinking can cause the same fight or flight reaction that a fire can, which is hard to understand sometimes, but true. So in fight or flight, it's pretty easy to detect because you have all these symptoms that feel like a panic attack in the classic sense. And that those particular symptoms though allow you to function optimally for the condition of not thinking about stuff but doing things, moving towards the enemy to fight, so to speak, or run away from the threat as fast as one can with all the adrenaline in the system. Freeze is a bit different because freeze is a mechanism that essentially shuts you down so that you can hunker down and go undetected. It's said, there's varying research on that, but it's said that it's more common in women than in men because biologically speaking, it was the women, the children who had to duck into the undergrowth and sit it out while the men went and fought. And so the freeze response is strongly associated with the vagus nerve, which calms down the pulse and the breathing and actually depresses it. So freeze in many people looks like they're actually fine. It looks like they're calm and collected and quite zen about things. But when you look closer, they're actually immobilized to varying degrees. Very lightly from just a bit unresponsive, a little bit less blinking or reaction, all the way to fully catatonic. So there's a whole variety of options there. Freeze can be something that's just become habitual, or it can be situational, but in either way, you're not capable of doing the thing that the body knows how to do in a fight or flight, after a fight or flight response, which is shake and tremble and allow the shock and the trauma to leave the system, which is what we're built for. And when you see it in animals, like if you see a zebra that just escaped a lion, they'll stand and shake, 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 shake. And then at some point they're done and they just move on with their life. So movement is a way to induce the natural release mechanism of the body and create equilibrium, not only hormonally and adrenally, but also mentally and emotionally. And so nonlinear is one of the modalities that you can use to unfreeze the body.
Which is a method you developed
Which is a method I developed, yeah.
Yeah, and so you advocate actually, and, I've seen you do this in situations where you've had something happening, deliberately moving, say, your fingers, wriggling your toes, that sort of thing. It doesn't have to be, some special way of moving, does it? Just even wriggling the fingers and squeezing the toes when you're under a lot of stress, or you're in a confrontation, or there's something like that, can restore a lot of that cognitive function that you lose from those stress responses.
Yeah, or just slight wriggling of your behind in the seat, moving the spine, feeling the feet, where you can feel your feet and you can feel your seat. That helps greatly reconnect with the body. And when the body is activated, the body can activate its natural genius and release these things.
Mm-hmm. And you're talking about the range of freezes, and at that extreme end, dissociation. People just checking out totally.
Yeah.
And not really remembering what they did, or not remembering at the times afterwards. Happens in traumatic situations.
Yeah.
And when you're able to get back in the body, you're able to sort of think better, take more productive action, and this sort of thing, isn't it? Right? Not only about releasing, also about effective action, if there is an effective action that can be taken.
Yes. Yeah. Or at least all of that, right? Releasing, allowing the body to come back into equilibrium, becoming effective where your whole body and your mind can be involved, and it's not one or the other. And then in the long run, sometimes it's perfectly all right to be a bit frozen, but at least you know that you are, and you know that when you can, you'll deal with it. So there's a recognition aspect to it as well.
So are you still doing movement? Are you still deliberately engaging in that? Is there still a danger of freeze sticking around or settling in even after the initial shock of a trauma?
Oh yeah, I mean, you went there with me this morning, right? Every time I see the house, it's fresh. It's not like, I've seen it, because in my mind the house reloads freshly as still existing anytime I don't see it, right? It's an interesting thing because I'm so visual, and also I'm next door and I'm home, and so I need something, and I have what I call phantom possession pain. Right? So I had a hangnail, so I go, oh, I need a nail clipper. Oh yeah, and then in my mind the drawer in my bathroom that no longer exists forms itself with the nail clipper exactly where I put it, where it's always at, because I'm also, as you know, very orderly, so things have a place, and that place reloads in my mind, and then the next thing that happens is, oh shit, it's gone. So it's a constant appearing and disappearing of reality as it used to be and no longer is, which is quite challenging, to say the least. It's going to make me cry. So it's a constant having to keep myself from going there. And every time I see the house, it's as fresh a shock as the first time. It actually gets worse over time, not better necessarily, because as life normalizes in a certain way, I just go about my day, and then it happens. Then I see it, and then it's like, oh shit. So to answer your question, I have to constantly work with it. I work with it last thing before I go to bed. I do formal nonlinear before I go to bed, and I meditate before I go to bed. And I have to step down, so I usually have a bath, then do some nonlinear, then take all kinds of herbal supplements and adrenal support, then sit, and then go to bed. And in the morning, the first thing I do when I wake up is nonlinear, laying down in bed and taking the time to feel my whole body and scan, and to the best of my ability, unwind it. And then once I've done that, I get up and I make lists. I have, as you know, I'm the queen of lists. So every morning I make a fresh list, and every morning I write about the things that come up and occur to me, and make notes, and on my dreams. I have very specific dreams that have the same theme pretty much every night. So I have to work with it every day, all day. But as you were saying earlier, one of the first things I did so that I could cope is I grounded myself in the things that mean a lot to me, which is teaching, of course, and the animals, and beauty, right, which has been super important, the turning towards beauty, away from the destruction. Not to whitewash the destruction, but to have a place to look and to be and to feel that has beauty. And I'll talk about that in a second. But it's a constant having to deal with finding places that I still have ground, because the ground is pretty much gone in the normal reality of me living in the house that I loved so much. At the same time, not whitewashing it or glossing over it, and at the same time also caring for my remaining animals. And we had to redo fences very quickly, and all the things that come with dealing with destruction. We're not even talking about dealing with insurances who don't really pay for fences, and all those kind of things. With just making sure everybody was cared for, and all living things were cared for, including the few trees that survived that needed water, but there's no electricity and the pumps are broken and blah blah blah. So it's an endless cycle of caring for the things that lived, caring for myself in the sense that I don't bypass but also don't succumb, and then using those things and turning them towards something. And the things I'm turning them towards is, of course, our next set of teaching events. And that's been really, really good because of the first things we're doing is new men's and women's groups, lineage women's work, and some teacher trainings, and non-linear teacher training, as a matter of fact, the second part. So using everything that I'm working with as a kind of a grist for the mill towards what we're going to be teaching in January and February. And that's been really, really useful and very, very good, because I can point it towards something and make it mean something outside of myself as a giving of that experience into the teaching. And that's been very good. And so, the first thing I did before I did anything else was I ordered new teaching supplies and new beautiful blankets and zafus and yoga mats and all of those things, and kitted out the studio we're going to be teaching in, and made it so that when teaching starts, it's an incredibly pleasing and pleasant space, so that there is beauty in the middle of all of that destruction, and so that the experience can be used and taught. And that's been really what has been anchoring me.
Yeah, and you're touching on a lot of strategies there, actually, and tools, and it might be interesting to touch on some of those. You've talked already about nonlinear, and as you mentioned, we have trained lots of nonlinear teachers, and we won't go into it. People are interested in nonlinear, I'll put the link in the show notes.
Yeah.
It's a whole modality. You can see it on the website, and there's probably someone near you anyway that's is qualified now. We've qualified a lot of teachers in that modality. But you're talking there about in addition to the movement, you're talking about what I thought you had said, journaling of some kind. You're talking about dream work, which of course is a staple of your Jungian training. You're talking about beautifying, you're talking about having meaning or finding some sort of productive way forward without glossing over the reality of the loss, or without pretending it's not bad or it's not painful or it's not sad, and without diminishing it. It's quite a tightrope, it seems, between sort of getting on with things but at the same time allowing yourself to feel the impact. And you also talked a bit about meditation. When you say sitting, I think you mean sitting meditation. And it's funny, I've got here, and I expected to see a bit of a war zone, and of course it looks like a war zone around here with all the houses burned down. But coming in the guest cottage, you seem to have put a fair amount of priority in beautifying it and furnishing your environment with what you could salvage from the house, little statue here or something like this, and also with certain decoration, and you've got plants outside now already. It doesn't seem like a very high priority thing to put time into.
Yes.
So why do you do that, and what is the reason that you prioritize that? And then perhaps we can touch on some of the other strategies that you were outlining as well.
Yeah. Well, to me, there's a sanity to be found in the mundane, right? And that particular sanity, that's always been something that I put a lot of attention on. And beauty, as I said, it's very important to me, having an environment that holds me and that's conducive to having to do the quite brutal work I have to do. And so it's a combination of making the space livable and functional, so that I can actually function optimally, and also to create a place where my nervous system can relax, and where things are in a place, it's orderly, it's organized, it's pleasing to the eye, And like you said, there are a few of the outside statues that survived, and I brought them over and I put flowers with them, and I bought flowers, even though it's the middle of winter. Even in California, there's not much available. I bought the 5 flowering shrubs I found at the garden center, and for Christmas, planted them and put them outside the door. So the first thing I see when I come from the destruction of next door are beautiful flowers, are camellias and geraniums. And that particular activity of mundane yet necessary house preparation makes it so I can do all the other stuff. And, ironically, and I told you this before, I now live under a mulberry tree that loses leaves like crazy right now. So I'm sweeping, and I'm sweeping specifically with the purpose of emptying out and emptying my mind, and doing the activity that I was trained to do in my early training, which is just emptying out through the sweeping. And there's lots and lots and lots of leaves, so it's an everyday thing. And I've developed a kind of routine in the morning. I wake up very early right now. I go out once I've done my lists and my nonlinear, and I had a cup of tea, and I sit and I have a second cup of tea while the sun comes up, and then I sweep, and then I start my day. And that's been very good and very useful. And it's a good strategy for me, and I think for many other people as well, is to do something that feels familiar and to turn the attention towards something that's beautiful.
And it seems like a civilizing your environment has an uplifting effect on the mind.
I think it does. I definitely think it does.
And sometimes all you can do is civilize your immediate environment in certain things, in certain adversities that you face. And of course, we're talking about these fires and so on, but I mean it's applicable. This is why we're having this conversation to many other things.
Yeah.
And sometimes you are a bit powerless to really tackle the thing itself.
Yeah.
But there's perhaps something in your environment you can change or civilize.
Well, like Professor Jordan Peterson says, whom you turned me on to, clean up your room, or and that's very, very true. If you can't create an environment in your immediate, just vicinity, you can't do anything else. You certainly can change the world and have a really messy room. I think there's some amazing clips where he speaks about that. And that's, of course, also a concept that's employed in a lot of different traditions, and certainly in my lineage, Vastu, the proper placement of things in space so that your nervous system can relax is very, very important. And it's certainly been a mainstay of my sanity for many years. As you know, when we travel together, I have to arrange my place, no matter where we are, in an Airbnb or whatever, in a way that my system can relax. And when my system relaxes, I can align and I can get stuff done.
Yeah, some of the things I've seen you do are, you have a little travel altar with a couple of small items there that you place, and you don't, redecorating these Airbnbs, not like that. Little touch here, little touch there.
Except for that time in Australia when I completely redid a bookshelf.
Well, they were terribly out of order.
Yeah.
You didn't alphabetize them, did you?
I just put them straight, and I think I color coded them a tiny little bit so that they were pleasing to the eye. But mostly I just put them from laying down to standing up.
The Vastu is the sort of, could we say, Indian feng shui sort of idea that's guided less by rules and more by...
It's guided less by mathematics. Proper feng shui, when done properly, requires the birth date of the person and the birth date of the house, and it's very, very mathematical, the way it's traditionally done. Of course, people now just hang a few crystals in a corner and, red scrolls on the doors or stuff. But in the Vastu traditions, it also depends. There's more, astronomically geared, but it's more about the placement in space, and that's a definite application of tidy up your room, clean up your environment.
And it's guided by feeling, isn't it?
It's much more in the way I was taught and the way I teach it and the way we've taught it is creating a space that's conducive to the activity that you want to perform in there.
So if people at home wanted to do a bit of this Vashtu in the immediate environment in which they're listening, what would you say to them, the first couple of steps? What should they be doing?
Well, it depends on the person's system, right? But in general, clearing and cleaning is the first step, meaning decluttering, making neat stacks of papers or books, finding some things that you find beautiful and arranging them in a way that is pleasing. And that could be, found objects. It could include shells or candles or, postcards or whatever people have. But creating cleanliness and order, but also creating beauty. And that can be done on a desk or, in your car even. Mm. Throw away shit is a good way to start, meaning stuff that's no longer needed or stuff that's just laying there because nobody wanted to go outside and throw it in the trash.
Yeah, and what about some of those other practices that you were talking about? You're talking about meditation, how have you applied that? You're talking about journaling, you're talking about dream work. Mm-hmm. Perhaps you could outline just roughly how you've been using those strategies.
Yeah. Well, I can go through them one by one. So an important one for me, and that's not always true for everyone, but in general, water is really good for the nervous system. So even if you're not in an extreme disaster zone situation, most people at the end of the day are pretty stressed out and overwhelmed and overloaded. Mm-hmm. So the stepping down from daily activity to nighttime activity, whatever that means to people, is an important process. And water certainly aids that process, either in the form of a bath or a shower or a swim or a cold dip. Different people have different ways of doing it. So I use the bath as a transition from the doing part of the day to the non-doing and releasing and relaxing part of the day. So I have a bath, and I have a bath without reading Facebook or Instagram. I've completely done away with social media because I just don't have enough available attention right now. And as you know, because you had to pick up the slack, I also didn't do emails for the first 2 or 3 weeks because it took too much away from the thing that I had to do and took too much mental energy. But in general, I try to have a bath without any reading or scrolling so that my system can calm down. And the water helps the nervous system relax, of course. And then from there, I do some nonlinear to release whatever I could feel. So, of course, the moment you step down, the areas of tension or pain or trauma amplify. You talk about that a lot in the ambient noise level. So, which,
well, basically, and when you relax, everyone knows that feeling. You sit down at the end of the day and you suddenly realize how tired you are, so for instance.
Right.
Or
how much your shoulders ache.
Etc. Yeah, because your mind was so focused on the activity, so that when you do relax enough, you start to feel what's underneath all the activity, and it can make that what is there feel louder. The pain, there's the tension in the shoulders. It seems louder than it was before, and it's not necessarily got any more tense. It's just that actually you've quietened down to the point where you can feel it suddenly. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So whatever shows up when I have the bath, I then work with the nonlinear movement formally, and then I sit. And when I say I sit, I'm not a hardcore meditator like you are in most of your daily activity. You meditate a lot more than I do, but I find it useful to just sit, right, without focus on anything or do breath practice or visualize or any of the things I've been taught or things that you teach and I've learned from you. I just sit the way you originally introduced me to, just sitting. And I just allow whatever goes through my mind, and that's usually a lot, to unwind itself, and I just wait till it unwinds. And there's usually, sometimes it takes a long time, even after nonlinear, where when I start sitting, my mind actually becomes a lot more active than when I start moving. So I just sit and I wait till the mind activity slows down. And when I feel that the mind activity slows down, then my body starts coming online, in a different way. Then meditation becomes quite blissful. My body becomes very relaxed and open and warm, and it's pleasurable. And at that point, I can start having internal motion, right? So I can feel my nadis and my channels and all of those kind of things. And at that point, I then usually go to bed and I just lay there and I feel, the central channel, and I relax, and then eventually that will lead to sleep. I haven't done any formal dream practice, so I'm not going for lucid, even though a lot of my dreams are lucid. I just allow the theme to run through me, and it's always the same theme, and it's very unpleasant. And I often wake up, with a little bit of fight or flight. And at that point, I journal, and I'll work with whatever shows up in the dream, and then I do some nonlinear and see that I can release it as much as I can. And then I, just write whatever comes up, and that could be a combination of things from the dream and things that I want to intend for that day, or questions that came up in the dream, or things I'm working with. So it can be a variety of things. I've also started writing in the sense that I would like to add a little bit about this experience to the book that's being finished right now, and The Wild Woman's Way. And we'll go to the publisher in about 3 weeks with hopefully the final edits. So I'm working on verbalizing some of the things we're talking about as a chapter in the book. Not the book, but just a chapter in the book. And then I go and I dry brush, and then I have a cold shower. And then I do the list making, and then my day starts. So those are some of the strategies I think that are useful, certainly useful for me, but useful in general, right? Engagement with the body, both in the realms of self-care, like the dry brushing and moisturizing, and bringing it back to the body and caring for the body in a time that doesn't really call for that instinctively.
It would be easy to overlook it.
Yeah.
And then your body sort of starts to break down underneath it, and you can't go on.
Exactly.
It's interesting. I'm hearing you're combining this bodily care as well as working with the body, with movement and so on, to release the accumulated stress, trauma, and so on of the tough time. But also, some of those practices are psychological in nature.
Mm-hmm.
Dreaming is among its many functions is that part of sleep. Just like some of the sleep you restore the body, healing the body, and so on. Dreaming is part of the psychological integration process, and when you're having dreams, you're having nightmares and this sort of thing, it's actually part of that is an integration of what's going on. So to give a bit of sort of space and friendliness towards the bad dreams and the stressful themes, and to realize actually this is part of the integration of my mind. This is part of that process, and welcoming it in a certain sense, being friendly with it is very good. And the writing out of things, thoughts, keeping a bit of a dream diary and writing out thoughts, and of course you're going to organize some of this as a chapter in your upcoming book. That also has the sense of getting the narrative straight, reflecting on it, aligning some of the psychologically the situation, and getting your mind, should we say, around the thing, and orienting yourself towards it, and that's very very useful strategy for any sort of stressful situation, any kind of adversity, or in general.
Yeah, I think so, and it's certainly something that I've told other people to do, right, over the years. And it has an interesting effect also because, of course, I'm not the first person who's lost everything,
No.
right, in a fire or otherwise. There's whole regions of the world where people have lost not only their homes but their lives, the lives of their children, right? They're fleeing, all of those kind of things. And certainly, you know, we this year spent quite a bit of time on lineage and liberation, right? We taught it, 5 times within a year and a half or so. And certainly the epigenetic aspect and the familial aspect of, you know, wars. I mean, you know, my ancestors lost everything in wars, and probably over many, many, many hundreds of years lost everything in wars. But even, I mean, my mother, my grandmother, grandparents on both sides lost everything in World War II and World War One as well. So the working with the archetypal themes of loss, devastation, fire, right? I mean, particularly in my lineage, fire and the, you know, Kali, which we can talk about a little bit in a moment because that was quite interesting. But the burning away, the throwing things in the fire, you know, of course, in the lineage aspect, you know, my grandparents lost everything in bombings and fires and stuff. So there's an archetypal and familial aspect that's good to keep in mind, so it doesn't become so crunched down to poor me. Because of course I have poor me moments, you know. I mean, who wouldn't? But there's a widening of that poor me into a understanding of the archetype, right? And the storytelling and the lore of women, in my case, since I'm a woman, but humans. But I'm feeling specifically women having lost everything, right? I lost dogs, which is like children to me, but other women have lost children in wars and are losing children in wars, and, you know, to all kinds of things. So the engagement with that's very fruitful. It's very painful, but it's very fruitful. And interestingly enough, the insurance adjuster who came in something like this, you get assigned by your insurance an adjuster. It's called a catastrophic loss adjuster. So there's special people. They fly in from the Midwest and they put up in hotels here, and they get 5 or 6 cases assigned each. And my insurance adjuster was an incredibly lovely, kind, and patient man. I was really touched and surprised because he was so both matter of fact but also compassionate, and he was nothing like I expected. I expected, you know, somebody to come and try and tear it all down and not pay, or, you know, I mean, I don't know yet what the insurance is going to do, but he was a very lovely man. And I said to him, we sat there and he asked me all kinds of questions of what the house looked like, because of course there's nothing left, right? So I said to him at some point, well, you only get to see destruction, right? He's been in Katrina and, you know, like all these horrible devastations. So you're a little bit like a pathologist. You're in the morgue, you only see the dead bodies. Right? And I was kind of making a joke about it. And he said, yeah, it's true. You know, I only see the absolute devastation. And then he said, but you'd be surprised how resilient people are. And the way he said it was very touching, right? Because he probably sees the very worst in people, but he also sees people going, okay, well, I mean, there's nothing left. What now, right? And of course, when you have insurance, however minimal the insurance is, there is somebody who at least supports you, so to speak, regardless of what you think insurance and all of that. But just somebody saying, yes, you lost all of this, and yes, you did pay us every month, and so we're going to give you a certain amount of money. And I don't know how much it's going to be and if it's enough to rebuild and all of that. But, you know, that knowledge that there is some help in that form, he was talking about how that gives people the boost to continue. And I think that's that's the part of the dream work and the archetypal work I'm working with, is the resilience piece, and the just, you stand up, you dust yourself off, and on you go.
Yeah, one of the interesting things about this, the aftermath of this incident here in Ojai, is there have been polarizing responses in the community, but generally it's very interesting to hear, and you've told me the stories and I've seen it firsthand, the pulling together of the community, and actually how people have been helping each other and supporting each other, and going out of the way to do that. And of course, there have also been people sort of hoarding, doing all sorts of other strange things. But
looting. We had looting.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And you've received many messages of support, and more than just messages, actually, in other cases, real support from people in all kind of ways. And perhaps as we come to the end of our time, you talk a bit about what that's meant, because often our loved ones or our dear friends are facing a very hard time.
Yeah.
Something you can't fix. You can't sort of ride in and fix the situation. Maybe it's not a fixable situation.
Yes.
And you want to help.
Yeah.
But you want to support them somehow. And some people, afraid of making it worse, don't say anything. Other people ride in, make it worse, and then there are those who can actually help and actually support. So what is it that makes that actually helps?
Yeah.
What can people do generally for those who are in hard time?
So I think the first thing that anyone can do for someone who finds themselves in some shocking or surprising situation is to just acknowledge that it's bad. Just to say, wow, that is bad, or this sucks, or this is terrible. Because one of the worst things, and I remember this also from James's death, when James died, is when people immediately bypass their original feelings to make it better. Because you can't make it better. And part of grieving the thing is to not make it better, but to allow it to be what it is, whatever that is. And so the acknowledgement of it being a bad situation goes a long way. And then, and this is hard for most people want to do then something that makes them feel like they made a difference, or that makes it better for them. So it depends on the person, but I would suggest, not only from how I'm built, but also from my clinical practice, is to not necessarily soothe people. A lot of people have offered to hug me or touch me, and they're going, yeah, here it's better. You don't actually want to interrupt the process of grieving, and people grieve in different ways, and sometimes it's not appropriate to hug somebody because they might start crying, and it might not be the moment to start crying because they have to be functioning, they have to talk to a doctor or an insurance adjuster or things like that. So to not impose bodily help, right? I very much appreciated it when people would say, can I give you a hug? And I could say, no, I actually don't want to be touched right now. And then other people just randomly groping me, essentially, to make themselves feel better. So I think respecting people's space and their level of shock or trauma or processing ability is a very good gift you can give somebody. Offering help without butting in is very useful. To say, if there's something I can do, let me know. I'm here. When the time comes, blah, 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 I'm here. Put me on a list for when there's something to do, or call me when you need a ride to the doctor, or whatever it is. That's useful. It's not useful when you have to manage other people's emotions and the need to make themselves feel better in addition to whatever you're having to do. Things that were surprising and very lovely was a few people took the initiative to do things that I would have never asked for, because I don't ask for help very easily anyway. First of all, because I'm well resourced in my mind, and also because I get one-track mind. So one of the nicest things somebody did is they texted me and said, my husband's on the way up with some food. She asked up front, she said, I would like to make you food. would you take it? And I said, yes. Begrudgingly, but I said, yes. And then he showed up with 2 bags with really beautifully prepared food, properly portioned, labeled, little things with it, totally thought out so that I didn't have to even think. I just opened packages and he did stuff. And that was really lovely. And very touching. So, and then somebody else sent some clothes by that she picked up at a store when I literally only had my work clothes, right? And it was like a very cozy pair of sweatpants and some very practical t-shirts. And she sent me one of her old jackets so that I would be warm. And that was really, really lovely because it was not necessarily something I thought I needed, but it helped. It was like somebody thought, what does she actually need, and provided that without me having to think what I needed. Yeah, so those kind of little things really made a difference. And then, of course, within the community, and we talked a little bit about that earlier, it was incredible to feel how everyone was giving of their resources. And our direct neighbors and also the people up here in the valley, I mean, everybody just gave of their resources and to each other, and everyone just stopped by. And one of the beautiful things in the beginning, which I would not have thought would have been a good thing because I'm very private, but people would just show up, and people would show up with extra water or a blanket or dog food. And then, of course, somebody here in the community organized a relief center where people could get tools and face masks and things like that. So in general, as a community, it's brought us much, much closer. And we've always had a very good functioning community. But in that particular moment, you could see the generosity of people, both in spirit and in actual things. Generators showed up, charger cables, food, water, drink, lots of red wine was consumed because that's what was needed. And people would just talk to each other, and everywhere we went and everywhere I go, we talk about it because it's useful for people to talk about it and process it and have somebody else who's gone through that experience, because shared experience is very important in any of those situations, which is why in urban areas and for many people it's the internet, right? Chat rooms, forums, help groups of all kinds are useful because you're dealing with other people who've been there either at the same time as you or before you. And that's been very useful for me, and I know it's been very useful for many of my clients, everything from people having lost babies, stillborns, and all kinds of things where you find yourself in a very odd situation where it's useful to speak with other people who have shared experience.
In the UK, we have the tradition of making a cup of tea.
Yes.
No matter how bad the news is, the first thing you do is you go and make a cup of tea, or you make a cup of tea for the person while they're processing their
Yes.
These sorts of acts of kindness and companionship do seem to go an awful long way in uplifting the spirit. That's wonderful to hear about that in the community. Well, we're out of time. Before we sign off, is there anything you'd like to say on the matter? Finally.
Well, I mean, for everyone listening, and certainly to you as well, and Casey, thank you, because I've been very supported, and I haven't answered any emails, but for all of those who have sent me emails and messages and Facebook messages, it means a lot to get the support, and it's good to hear that people are thinking about it and feeling things about it. It's very, very useful, even though I haven't had the space or time to thank people. I'm doing that now. Thank you. And like I said to you and Casey, you spent your time off, your Christmas vacation, so to speak, manning the ship so we can move on. That meant I could actually put my attention there fully. And it means that then, come the new year, I can put my attention fully back into teaching and traveling and creation of all kinds. And that means a lot. And I'm very much looking forward to us getting started again.
Great. Well, thank you very much for this conversation, Michaela.
Thank you.
You can find out more about Michaela and the workshops she teaches and the workshops that we teach together at www.michaelaboehm.com.